Hey everyone, this video is about everything you need to know about color temperature. We'll start going over the fundamentals, covering the easier topics first, and looking at some example illustrations to help it all sink in. This video will be about color temperature in the scope of its art applications rather than getting too into the scientific applications and theories. First, let's talk about perceived color temperature. Perceived or learned color temperature is the idea that we know how red things are hot and blue things are cold based on our personal experiences. This is the easiest topic we're covering because you're probably already aware of it, whether you've noticed it before or not. When we think of fire, we typically picture red-hot flames, and with ice, we usually picture it being a cold blue. This works because we've been trained to make this association throughout our lives when interacting with the world around us. If most fires burned green, then we would think that green things look hot. Because of this association, we can begin to understand the feeling we can evoke through the strategic use of warm and cool colors in our artwork. Now let's look at some examples. Here are two beautiful illustrations, one of a nice warm beach by Kuroneko no Pei, and one of The Handler in the Ancient Forest by Adam Rio Ford. We can tell pretty easily by looking at these that they are sunny and warm environments. The beach looks like the middle of a hot day during the summer. The sun is out, the sky is pretty clear, and the sand especially looks hot to the touch. The ancient forest looks very warm too. I can just imagine the heat and humidity from being in the middle of a tropical forest like that. But what would happen if we just tweak the colors slightly to make them cooler? Suddenly, the beach doesn't look so warm. If we ignore the clues like the color of the trees in the background, this feels more like a cool day at the beach in autumn rather than a hot day in the middle of summer. And what if we did the same for this illustration of The Handler? Look at how much of a difference the tiny tweak in color balance makes. It's still a lush forest, but it doesn't look very tropical anymore. It looks much cooler now, especially in the shade. This is the magic of perceived color temperature. We can infer just by looking at the color of an image what temperature the objects or environment may be. Pretty impressive. Relative color temperature is how warm or cold colors look relative to each other. This next concept is a little bit trickier to understand in my opinion. Let's start out with a simple example using some colored squares. Here are a couple of blue squares, both of the same cold blue. What if we add some red at around 12% opacity to one of them? Suddenly, one is cooler than the other. They are both still blue, but the left one appears warmer than the other. This is known as relative color temperature. Even when given a smaller sample size of colors, or even just two nearly identical colors such as in this example, we still try to categorize them on a scale of warm to cold. And, of course, this works with warm colors like red. Now we have a cooler red and a warmer red. Now that we know how this can work both ways, I'll take a moment to demonstrate it with green. We can add some blue to one square and some red to another. Even though all squares are still very much green, we have a warm square, a cool one, and a neutral one. Spatial ability, or visuospatial ability, is the capacity to understand, reason, and remember the visual and spatial relations among objects or space. Now we're going to talk about how color temperature informs our perception of depth through our spatial ability. The general idea here is that warm colors look closer, while cool colors look farther. We can see this in action with squares too. Notice how the cooler colored squares look far away, while the warmer colored squares look closer. It becomes even more apparent when they overlap. It's almost as if the cooler squares are pushing the warmer ones toward the viewer. That's our spatial perception abilities in action. For example, I found a few landscape illustrations that I really like that demonstrate this effect. First is this incredible illustration of Tokyo by Kimi no Nawa. Look at all that warm sunshine on the buildings, the plants, and the pavement. We have cool blue shadows in the shade and a bright blue sky. You can really feel the depth of this picture if you imagine walking down the stairs and past those apartment buildings. There's a long straight street that looks like it ends way off in the distance, closer to the taller office buildings. But if we just change the color temperature by replacing those warm yellows with blue, and make the handrails a little cooler color for good measure, the image suddenly feels flat. Sure, you can still tell those buildings are probably far away because the artist drew this in perspective, but it certainly isn't the first impression I get when looking at this image anymore. Let's look at another. Here's a beautiful landscape by Magumo 24K. We can clearly see the foreground, middle ground, and background in this one. Notice how the mountains get cooler and less saturated as they move further away? See how the vibrant saturated yellow paint on the railroad crossing pulls it towards you and into the foreground? See how the cooler red roof of the building in the background contrasts against the trees in the middle ground, telling you that one is much closer than the other? These are all examples of the artist's understanding how to exploit our spatial perception to add an intuitive sense of depth. Whether we're aware of it or not, there are clues all over this illustration telling us that some objects are closer than others. To demonstrate this more clearly, let's make some changes. I'll change the color balance so that the warmer colors become cooler. I took away the vivid yellow paint in the foreground. I also removed those red trees from the middle ground. Suddenly, the image feels flat and boring, in comparison, of course. We still have a sense of depth thanks to the artist's use of perspective, but it isn't as strong and we don't feel it right away. If you wanted to see the original next to the version with the paint removed, here it is. Look at how much of a difference that yellow paint makes. Leaving the paint in pulls the tracks closer to us, placing them firmly in the foreground. Pretty impressive. While we're on the topic, I want to touch on atmospheric perspectives. Atmospheric perspective refers to the techniques we use as artists to create a sense of depth in our artwork. As light bounces around the atoms in the atmosphere on its way to our eyes, not all the photons complete the trip to us. This causes objects in the distance to appear to have a cooler hue, darker tint, and less saturation. If you've ever been lucky enough to live near mountains, you've likely noticed this. This is a painting titled The Tea by Mary Cassatt. Using what we've learned, see if you can notice the ways Mary manipulates her spatial perception. Look at how she desaturates the background, giving it a slightly darker tint, and adds a cool blue hue to mimic atmospheric perspective. This gives the painting a wonderful feeling of depth, making the room seem large even though we can neither see any clear use of perspective nor the size of the room. Cool and warm colors can also be used to show emotions. On the left, we have a warm and happy illustration of Vein and Palmo by Luminous Slime. And on the right, we have a few panels from Chainsaw Man by Tatsuki Fujimoto. What's particularly interesting about this Chainsaw Man section is how you can see the fear setting in on Top Knot's face as the panels become colder. The icy cold blue symbolizes the fear, loneliness, and discomfort engulfing him, and projects that feeling back onto you, the reader. Unsurprisingly, if we change the color balance of these two images, the effect no longer works. One more powerful effect we can enhance with good use of warm and cool colors is contrast. Using a combination of warm and cool colors evokes a particular feeling in the viewer. As artists, we rely on contrast as one of the principles of art. Contrast in color temperature is no exception. Look at all the contrast in these images. You'll notice some shows and video games take advantage of this too, such as Attack on Titan and Elden Ring. They use this contrast as part of their art style by ensuring that nearly every shot plainly shows cool and warm colors. Thank you again for watching, and I hope you were able to learn something new. If you like this video, please remember to like and subscribe.